Okay, it's 12 o'clock, so I'll kick us off. Just a little bit of housekeeping to start off. We will be circulating the slides after the session, including the slides are our contact details as well, so please do feel free to drop us a line if there's anything you'd like to pick up following today's webinar. We will also be having time at the end of this session for questions, so please do use the Q&A box or the chat box to raise your questions during the session. I can see some people are in the chat already, so that's great to see. I want to try and keep this interactive. In terms of today's session, we're going to be looking at the Regulator of Social Housing's annual regulatory casework review for 2025 and some key lessons and practical takeaways from that. The session's due to finish by 1 o'clock. As I said, we'll keep some time towards the end. Feel free to drop your questions in as we go along and we'll pick them up towards the end of the day. I'm Gemma Bell and I'm a partner at Devonshires and I jointly head our regulatory and governance team, and I'm delighted to be joined by a couple of the DTP team today. Who wants to go first?
So hi, I'm Mags. I joined DTP last year, so I'll be talking about risk shortly.
Hi everyone, my name's Diane Carney and I do a lot of work around governance and consumer standards. So I'll be picking up data and safety of in the home.
Hello everyone, my name's Marcus Evans and I'm a senior consultant with DTP. I'll be running through the value for money feedback in the case review and also touching on the customer voice element.
Brilliant, thanks guys. As well as questions, if you've got anything you want to share in terms of good practice you've seen in your organisation or things that have worked really well for you, please do feel free to share that in the chat box as well. I think it's really helpful that we all learn from each other as part of this as we can. Okay, so kicking off, I thought I'd start off by setting the scene a little bit. We obviously had the new consumer standards which came into force on the 1st of April last year, so we're nearly 18 months in to the new regime, which is slightly terrifying, isn't it? But I can't believe it's October, to be honest. We also saw as part of that the removal of the serious detriment test, so that bar that the regulator previously had in terms of its ability to intervene and become involved in relation to the consumer standards, and we saw that move over to the proactive regulation regime by the Regulator of Social Housing around the consumer standards, with the consumer regulation now incorporated within inspections themselves. So much as I dislike maths, I have prepared this graph for you to kind of give a bit of a picture around where we are at the moment around the C1 to C4 gradings. So you'll be aware that although the language doesn't specifically talk about compliance and non-compliance, C1 and C2 roughly are compliant gradings, with C1 being the highest grading. C3 and C4 indicate non-compliance, with C4 being the lowest of the gradings. So these come out of the routine inspections that continue to apply to those providers who have 1,000 or more social housing properties. And at the moment we have on the C1 side 30 private registered providers with a C1 grading and 4 local authority registered providers with a C1 grading. For C2, we've got 44 private registered providers with a C2 and then 18 local authority providers with a C2 grading. So not all doom and gloom in the local authority sector, as some people may indicate, that we do have a number who are compliant at the moment around the consumer standards. Then on the C3 side, we do see a sharp rise there around the local authority grading. So we've got 32 local authority registered providers with a C3 grading and 5 private registered providers with a C3 grading. And then on C4, we only have 6 local authority registered providers at the moment with a C4 grading. And there are around 109 who haven't been assessed yet or who are currently going through the assessment process. So we'll see a bit more around that as the picture continues to move. So the focus of today's session is on the Regulatory Casework Review 2025, which was issued on the 9th of September. It's the first annual Regulatory Casework Review that's been produced by the Regulator of Social Housing, which picks up on consumer and governance together. So it sets out the key themes from the regulator's regulation of social landlords over the past year and looks at, as I said, governance, financial viability and consumer standards. As Marcus mentioned, it does also pick up some bits around value for money, which is interesting because it doesn't specifically touch on the value for money standard, but there are a couple of messages coming out of the review around value for money considerations, which we'll go into later on in the session. The intention behind the review is to use the inspections and the responsive cases as examples to allow all providers, irrespective of their size or complexity, to strengthen and improve their own approaches to compliance with the regulatory standards. As I said, the regulator has been implementing new methods in regulation over the last 18 months through its proactive inspection regime. So that does mean for housing associations and other private registered providers, so for-profits, for example, we have the integrated inspections covering both economic and consumer standards. And on the local authority side, we have the remit of the regulator covering consumer standards and the rent standard. We're going to go through a number of the key messages and some things you should be thinking about in terms of lessons learned and what key takeaways there are for you. But I think a key message for all landlords that the regulator is keen to push across in line with the co-regulatory regime is that landlords should not wait for inspections to identify issues. So if you do identify issues, you should be looking to self-refer when problems do arise. I'm going to go through some of the key messages coming out of the review in a moment, but certainly things around risk management, data-driven decision-making and tenant voice, key messages coming out and completely in line with messages we've seen before, both coming out of the sector risk profile, but also the kind of consumer standards code of practice as well. Really, the aim of the overall review and the consumer standards changes have been around improving safety and performance and accountability to residents and ultimately ensuring safer and better managed homes for residents in the sector. So I'm going to do a quick summary of some of the key messages coming out of the review, and then I'm going to hand over to the DTP gang to talk a bit more about what they're seeing and what's been working well and what they'd recommend you focusing on. So the first one is about managing risk and making that fundamental to the way that you are working as a provider. And what the regulator says is it's really fundamental for providers to have effective arrangements in place to understand risks and the controls that they need to manage those risks. So a bit like the brakes on a car, you know, you can go fast, but as long as you've got the right brakes to stop you and slow you down when you need to. It's also about ensuring that you have strategic planning that matches your risk appetite. So thinking about how you're defining and clarifying your levels of risk, understanding the types of risks you're willing to take and making sure that your activities match up to that. And Mags is going to talk about that in a bit more detail later on. Also thinking about things like third-party risk and how you mitigate some of that. And we've seen that around things like contractor failures, but also issues around managing agents or repairs contractors not carrying out services in the way they're supposed to. And that really means that boards in particular or councillors or local authorities are able to look at how they can assess the risks and make sure that they're performing in line with the risk appetites that they have set. Secondly, it's about using data effectively, and clearly a much bigger focus under the consumer standards about having data at property level and that data be accurate. Also thinking about data you have around things like complaints and data that gives you tenant insight, and again we'll touch on that later on. Thinking about how you're managing some of the things coming out around particularly things like post-merger risks, and we have seen downgrades linked to, in particular, issues that have been identified as part of due diligence or as part of integration planning not being addressed as part of the post-merger completion process. I think a key message as well is about being curious about your data and acting on what it tells you. So if you are seeing messages coming out of the data that you're seeing, how are you then using that to inform how you set priorities going forward? Third one is about keeping tenants' homes safe, and clearly no shock there in terms of the whole focus of the consumer standards and the new safety and quality standard. And the regulator really wants to be confident that every landlord is able to ensure the safety of their tenants' homes and associated communal areas. The review really stresses, as the regulator has done for a number of years, that it's the fundamental responsibility of governing bodies, whether that's boards or councillors and senior leaders, to have effective oversight of performance against landlord health and safety requirements. And clearly within the standards as well, we've seen the greater focus away from not just doing checks as required under law, but also making sure that remedial actions are being managed properly and prioritised according to risk. Clearly, safety is a non-negotiable. It's an absolute legal and regulatory obligation and not just seen as a best practice requirement. And it's about considering safety in the round and not necessarily just focusing on one risk or another. Also, just in terms of keeping tenants' homes safe, as I've kind of talked about already in relation to third parties, making sure there's a clear line of sight around third-party delivery of services in relation to health and safety, and that performance is being monitored in practice. Next one is about demonstrating value for money. And the regulator is focusing on the fact that you are there to not only provide good quality homes for tenants who can't otherwise afford to house themselves, but also how you're tackling the housing crisis. So how you're helping to offer homes to those that can't afford them. So it's really essential that landlords are thinking about how they can maximise their resources and think proactively about how they may be able to deliver solutions which cover both of those areas, really. The review talks about thinking about how you're using your resources effectively and doing that regularly, and it's really kind of stressing the mission for which housing associations have been set up in particular. Last one, just about integrating tenants' views into decision making. Again, a clear one coming out of the new new standards around accountability to residents and making sure that they do have an effective role in relation to decision making. And I know Marcus is going to touch on that later on as well. But thinking about how you're hearing messages coming from tenants through a variety of sources, how they're effectively engaged in governance mechanisms, and clearly that has been something that's been focused on as part of the consumer inspections, with different approaches being taken as the inspections process has kind of progressed, as the regulator has refined its approach to what looks like good consumer engagement there. Lastly, just to flag, as I said before, big focus on self-referral. Don't just wait for an inspection. And if you do discover an issue, make sure that you're engaging early on so that you can show that you're taking steps to address those issues that have been identified. I just wanted to quickly touch on a slight change in focus that we're seeing here. And I think coming out particularly of things like the Labour conference last week, I've got a picture there of Steve Reed in his Build Baby Build hat, which is slightly disturbing. I think it's slightly MAGA-like, but we'll ignore that. It's fine. Again, that thing around value for money, moving the pendulum to not just, we've seen quite a big swing towards investment in existing stock, the quality agenda. I think key message is obviously that we have this ambitious programme for new homes that has been set by the Labour government. We've seen the announcements around capacity. Big focus coming out, as I mentioned, around the value for money requirements under the regulatory casework review is you aren't just there to deliver quality homes in terms of existing residents, you're there to think about how can we push the envelope and supply more for those who need it. So again, I think we will see a greater focus around value for money going forward as part of the new regulatory requirements. And on that, I'm going to hand over to Diane.
Brilliant, thank you, Gemma. Lovely to see everybody here. As I said at the front end, I'm Diane Carney, work for DTP. I'm just going to talk to you about the data quality requirements and also the providing safe homes. And I think one of the things that we all noticed from the casework review is that it does cover all regulatory standards. And what's absolutely clear is that the standards are not standalone. So there's several interdependencies that flow across the standards. For example, we might find anything that's found in consumer regulation might passport over into governance. And that could be poor oversight of health and safety or repairs, could be indicative of weak governance. And likewise, an effective risk framework can also negatively impact on landlord services, which are delivered to tenants. So while we are going through these separate areas, there's a lot of interdependencies and a lot of crossover. However, next few slides, we are going to focus on, we'll start with data. So I think in terms of the data quality and requirements, what's really clear from the report is that up-to-date and comprehensive data is absolutely critical to manage risks. And we have been seeing issues as well relating to data for some time now that are reflected in the consumer gradings and also the narrative judgments. And that could be poor or incomplete data, which is often an issue, and also data that might be old. And also where data is not being used proactively. So there is an expectation from the Regulator of Social Housing that reliable data will be available across all operations. Data should absolutely be the cornerstone of your decision making, and it's critical that the data a landlord holds is of a high quality. The other thing as well that we also see, and that will be assessed, for want of a better word, during inspection, is that storage and that accessibility of data and making sure that it's kept up to date. So it's great if you have a lot of data, but how accessible is that data to colleagues who might need it to deliver diverse services? Is it stored safely, etc.? So the need for reliable data cuts across the regulatory standards for the consumer element. That could include stock condition, and I think everybody knows around the requirement of 100% physical inspections, and they should be used to assess decency, to inform your investment requirements, as well as to ensure that homes are hazard-free. There's been a significant move away from the historical practices whereby 10 or 20% stock condition surveys were acceptable and cloning data was permissible. That's an absolute no-go in the current regulatory regime. Gemma touched on property-related health and safety data, in terms of making sure that compliance programmes are delivered on time, safety checks are done well, certificates are also approved, and that an important thing around the remedial works, ensuring that they have full visibility within your governance structure and that they are managed effectively as well. Tenant data is another main area, you know, using that data to understand the diverse needs of your tenants and tailoring services on an individual level, but as well as a corporate level. So using what data you have to see whether there is fair and equitable access to the landlord services, you know, that is a key cornerstone of the transparency, influence and accountability standard. And being able to demonstrate that as part of inspection would put you in a very strong place. So property tenant data is quite heavily, or has been heavily focused on the regulatory judgments, but we also wanted to flag the requirements of data around areas such as complaints. So is your performance accurate and robust around complaints management? We do see that a lot of complaints can be managed on spreadsheets across the sector, which if there's controls around those spreadsheets, you know, and everything's going fine with them, that isn't, you know, we wouldn't advocate throwing your spreadsheets away, but if you can find a system that'll do it for you, that's preferred. Allocations as well, you know, making sure that there's fairness in relets. So what does your data tell you about how many nominations there's been, how many management moves, how many CBL, etc., making sure that those relets are fair. And also areas such as tenancy sustainment, antisocial behaviour, you know, if you have great policies and procedures in place, what is the data telling you around the delivery of those policies? So if we can just move on to the next one, please, Gemma. Fab. So if you have great data, fantastic. It's not good enough nowadays just to have it. It is about that proactive use of the data and making sure that triangulation takes place. So you might have multiple sources of data that will point you to a different aspect of an area, and it's about making sure those are triangulated and checked to make sure decisions are holistic. So repairs is a great example. So you could have some performance data that is showing you repairs is high, so it's in your 90s for keeping to emergency timescales and non-emergencies. Transactional satisfaction might be high. However, your TSMs might be lower, and repairs could feature heavily in complaints and/or compliments. And then there's financial data to consider around repairs. So lots of data sets around repairs, and each will give you a different view of the repair service. And we really do advocate in terms of that triangulation and using all those data sets to take a view. So a couple of points to consider around data. First of all, are you using that data to inform decision making, investment planning, repairs programs, tenant data? Can you use that to access fair and equitable outcomes? TSMs, are they created, particularly the management TSMs, are they created from robust data sources? And also, has your data collection and processes been tested? Have you had an external review on those? Has internal auditor tested them for you? And also, does your data need to be on the risk register? If there are issues with your data, does it need to move over and be managed proactively in a way? And I think what we often see across the sector is that whole, we've got loads of data in every four corners of the organisation, but are we data rich and insight poor? Are we using that to make our decisions? So just moving on to safe homes. And again, just expanding on what Gemma had said at the front end, there is some evidence in the sector that where other priorities come into play, the providing safe homes can be taken for granted, for want of a better word, or assumed that because it was at a high standard, delivery is still being maintained. And it's absolutely critical that you don't take your eye off the ball, for want of a better expression, in terms of that providing safe homes. Effective controls, robust oversight, as Gemma said at the front end, is again critical, and the regulator will seek that assurance is being given to your governing bodies, your boards, your councillors, and also that it has visibility within your senior leadership team. We'll also flag that it's really important that any reporting ensures that the visibility of communal area performance is also included, and also remedial works around those. Very often we do see them lumped together, for want of a better word, and the standard is very clear that it's domestic properties and your communal areas. So just a flag to make sure that they are clear in your reporting, and also that there's no omissions. You know, reporting should be clear, it should be concise, it should be transparent. And we also recommend, because we do see a lot of providers reporting health and safety by percentage only, and we would always recommend that you include actual numbers for that visibility piece as well. Percentages can sometimes mask the extent of an issue. And I think if we could just move on to the last slide for safety there, please, Gemma. I think, as Gemma again touched on at the front end, there's no delegation of responsibility. Any services that are delivered in-house, subcontracted out, or through managed agents, etc., they all must have robust oversight. The code of practice is really explicit in that responsibility lies with boards and councillors of registered providers to deliver the outcomes of the standards. And it can sometimes be easier to have that control and oversight of in-house services, but don't forget about those external services, because they are just as critical. And that's not just for health and safety, that's across the board as well. And I think if you do have any gaps in safety, very much like if you have a gap in data, having that clear action plan to improve performance and to close that gap, or to strengthen the area that might be lower performing, is absolutely critical. So a couple of points to consider to close off the safety of homes. You know, check in, are all your areas of health and safety covered by your KPIs and the associated reporting? Do programmes of inspection and remedials have that full coverage, that full extent? And where your performance isn't 100%, do you know why? And is there a plan to address that? And then finally, critically important, is does your governing body have full and transparent access to the information that they need to have? And with that, I shall hand over to Mags, who's going to explore in more detail the risk elements in the report. And over to you, Mags.
Thanks, Diane. Thank you. So Diane's mentioned risk, and I'm just going to pick up on that a little bit. This headline is in quote marks because make managing risk fundamental to the way you work is the first headline in the regulatory casework review. And it underpins the regulator's consistent message about the importance of effective risk management. So the review emphasises the need to set strategic direction and ensure activities match risk appetite, to manage risk, including third-party risk, and crucially to ensure sufficient oversight of risk and quality assurance. And we would absolutely echo the regulator's message here. And we're going to break that down a little bit and offer some suggestions over the next few slides. So if we can move on to the next one, thank you. So the regulator has pointed to the need to set clear strategic objectives and to have an agreed risk appetite that supports delivery of those objectives. And there's obviously a need for good discussion and shared understanding so the board's risk appetite can be considered in decision making. But what does that look like in practical terms? So one suggestion is to think about the board papers and the quality of the board papers and make sure they're written in consideration of risk appetite. So, for example, where a paper concerns an activity that, or a performance issue that takes the organisation close to or beyond agreed risk appetite, that needs to be pulled out in the narrative and highlighted in the report. So highlighting risk in that way doesn't necessarily mean, oh, end of discussion, you know, there's a fundamental issue here, or we can't do whatever this proposal is. But what it means is that if it's highlighted, the board can consider risks and controls and really make a well-informed decision. We'd also suggest regular review of risk appetite, preferably at least annually, certainly when the corporate strategy changes, and whenever there is significant change in either the internal or the external operating environment. Risk appetite needs to relate to the risks faced at any point in time and the capacity of the organisation to deal with those risks. And obviously the world is not static, so what might be okay at one time might not be okay at another time, so important to keep refreshing it. Let's look next at managing risk. It's really important to understand how risk flows, and the regulator makes this point in the casework review. And by that, we're talking about how risk flows through different areas of the business or from one activity to another. Most organisations are aware that risk in one entity can have an impact on another or at group level. So in a group structure, there's clearly a need to ensure robust oversight of risk in all entities, so not thinking about things in silos. Secondly, boards need to know that their organisations are not exposed to additional or unmanaged risks through contracting with third parties. So that's then there's a need to think about what assurance is in place, due diligence, strong contract management. How do you know that things are working as they should? And thirdly, everyone's probably aware that the requirements for effective risk management are set out in the Governance and Financial Viability Standard. But as the Casework review points to, there's a really clear read across between risk management and strong governance and the delivery of outcomes for customers. So obviously, effective risk management is crucial to compliance with the consumer standards as well as good governance. And you can see that being drawn out in some of the regulatory judgments. And I just want to mention data in relation to risk again. So Diane's obviously talked about risk, and there's no apologies for mentioning it again, because it really is so important. The Casework review reminds us of the need to triangulate what your data is telling you. So from a risk perspective, that's around looking at performance data and saying, does this dip in performance mean we've got a risk crystallizing here or a trend emerging? And really thinking about the quality of narrative in the reports. So not just looking at tables of numbers, but what's the analysis that goes with those numbers into the performance reports? Do you know what's causing a performance issue? Is it a single isolated temporary concern? Or is it a wider problem with data or systems or oversight, so a bigger risk? Thinking then, if we move on to the next slide, about risk management responsibilities and what role everybody plays. So the leadership team is responsible for day-to-day risk management. It's part of what they do every day. It's about making sure there are effective controls and resources in place to manage both operational and strategic risks. The Audit and Risk Committee or Audit Committee or Audit and Assurance Committee is checking that the framework for risk management is robust and carrying out fairly regular deep dives and horizon scanning. I'd say board should horizon scan too, but perhaps it's a bit more in depth or more frequent at Audit and Risk Committee. An Audit and Risk Committee has a really important role in approving the internal audit plan and checking that it's really properly risk-based, that it's appropriate, that it's providing good coverage, that it's testing those controls, as Diane mentioned, and really making sure then that we've got assurance over the risks. An Audit and Risk Committee is offering challenge and seeking assurance about controls, but offering support to the leadership team too. Board has got the overall oversight and ownership of strategic risks, and it's accountable for the decisions. And the board needs to be routinely considering risk and their agreed risk appetite in decision making. So it's also offering healthy challenge and seeking assurance on the effectiveness of controls. And it's not on the diagram, but obviously most providers have got other committees and they too should be aware of board's risk appetite and should be thinking about risk when they're reviewing papers or performance reports and being prepared to flag concerns back through to the board, really playing that role in saying, well, we're seeing the finer detail and from our perspective, this is what's happening and we think it could be a risk to be discussed. I'd say think too about how you, sorry, just back on the other one. I'd think too about the committee structure. It's about using the specialism of the committee to add perspective and taking care to avoid both duplication or diluting the board's oversight of key risks and issues. And lastly, just two-way communication. It's really important, excuse me, to have communication throughout the governance structure. I could have labelled that arrow culture because it's imperative that there is the right culture, a culture where it's okay to raise issues and escalate concerns. So it's all about making risk management fundamental to the way you work, and the best policies in the world won't be effective if the culture's not right. Okay, so let's have a look lastly on the next slide at oversight and assurance. So the Casework review stresses the need for quality assurance. In practical terms, these are just a few questions that boards and committees can ask, and leadership teams can really support with this by drafting quality reports, and hopefully this will increase assurance over risk management. So firstly, the actual risk report that goes through to Audit and Risk Committee or to the board, does it just look at the top 5 risks? And by that, I mean, when you rank risks in order of residual risk, high score first, are you only pulling out the top 5 and never looking at the bottom half of the strategic risk register? It's really important to look at risks that are outside of appetite or tolerance levels, wherever they appear in rank order on the register. Secondly, assurance on data quality. We've touched on that already. Look at those internal audit scopes. Do they check data reliability, reconciliations, calculations, or has there been any other independent assurance on data quality? It's really important to know that the data is reliable, so that then the decisions that are made based on that data are good decisions. Thirdly, independent review of the risk management framework itself. When was it last done? Best practice evolves, and it's always good to challenge your thinking. Then I would suggest risk assessment. Obviously, it's important to do the risk assessment, but sometimes it's easy to get hung up on the numbers. So is this a 3 or a 4, for example? It's more important to think about, is the risk description clear? Do we have a shared understanding of what this risk is? And then we can say, is the assessment right? Are the controls right? Are those controls actually in place? Are they effective? Are they realistic? And lastly, back to culture. Is it one that allows colleagues to flag concerns, or are colleagues perhaps afraid to admit that something's gone wrong or something might go wrong? Do they recognise when something is going wrong? Do they know how to escalate concerns? And that's obviously relevant throughout the organisation. And I'd say just managing risk is much more likely to be successful if concerns can be voiced openly and early. It's really important. So thank you. That's enough for risk for now. We've got time for questions at the end, and I'm going to hand over to Marcus now to talk about value for money.
Thank you, Max. Yeah, so one of the key headlines, as mentioned earlier, in regard to the casework review, is demonstrating whether or not you're able to demonstrate that you're achieving value for money. One of the cross-cutting themes, and certainly throughout the whole of the review, clearly states that. And this doesn't just mean about having a value for money strategy. Boards need to be accountable for delivering value for money, so it needs to be embedded within its governance arrangements. And not just that, but be able to evidence that it's not just in the value for money statement as well. So how is it being used on a regular basis as part of their considerations and decision making? So think about it from a point of view of every decision that goes to board is normally formulated in the board report. How are we communicating the value for money impact as part of those board reports, allowing board to consider that as part of those decision making? So it needs to be front and centre in influencing the organisation's strategic direction and certainly in the decision making processes. Next slide, please, Gemma. So with regards to demonstrating obviously the achievements in value for money, it's sorry, just moving on to the next slide. It's about being accountable for value for money, setting clear strategic objectives, balancing those strategic objectives as well. So boards need to balance around service quality, home improvements. As Gemma mentioned earlier, it's around also considering new developments, not just about standing still. It's around how can we sweat our assets, but also how do we maximise our resources to be able to deliver new products, new housing, and to customers as well. And obviously looking at the opportunity, how do we assess opportunities for value for money? How do we know that we're delivering value for money? It's around appropriate performance report and having key value for money and performance indicators in place. Next slide, please, Jem. Yeah, so we need to have a clear strategy led by the board on what we want to do, all linked back to the core purpose, part of the continuous improvement cycle. So think about it from a point of view of plan, check, review and improve to ensure you can demonstrate the achievements and outcomes and positive direction of travel. So we need to see that as part of strategic planning, that you're looking at your value for money objectives and how do they link into delivering those objectives as part of your corporate plan, always linking back to the core purpose. Is it embedded within the structure in your governance arrangements? And how's that articulated to the external audience and to customers to be able to demonstrate that? Setting those key outcomes, it's all about the outcomes. How can you demonstrate that you're meeting the business needs, but also the stakeholder needs? How does that feed into those arrangements? And looking at it from a point of view of not just the efficiency savings, but customer satisfaction as well, and comparing, benchmarking with peers, certainly really important. Okay, so next slide, please. So obviously being able to demonstrate the, the absolute cost and performance and understanding that strong understanding of those costs is essential for being able to optimize financial capacity and to be able to deliver services. Really important to demonstrate that you're making the most of your assets and your resources, maximising that resource efficiency. Social landlords have got to really maximise the available money, operate efficiently and provide that quality housing. Need to really evaluate alternative delivery models as well. So regular evidence-based appraisals of alternative methods, ensuring successful outcomes for value for money is really essential. So looking at the way you deliver services, how can you do things better? Looking at, other models out there, working in partnership with other organisations as well. But when you're doing those appraisals of value for money and certainly informing the board and getting the board to use that information, certainly it's all about the data, understanding your assets and getting the best use out of it, understanding how the organisation is performing, obviously the cost element of it as well, and the customer feedback. So it's all about those outcomes and being able to demonstrate that. And I know there's self-assessments, value for money statements, but think about how you do that as part of your everyday decision making. It's really, really important. Next slide, please, Emma. Okay, so how can we sustain value for money, which is really important? It's not just about the here and now, but what plans we've got in place for the future. And so we need to constantly assess and refine our approach to value for money. Regular operations reviews, looking at point of view of, how can we deliver services more efficiently, more effectively, but also looking at the ways in which we can enhance services as well, not just about making service savings. Looking as well around, data integration as well, making the most out of our IT and obviously development in IT, thinking about it from a point of view of innovation. How can we innovate and deliver services in different ways, and consider those alternative, models, looking at joint ventures, working in partnership, and how do we get the best use out of our resources, looking at those solutions. So it's really about challenging that status quo, demonstrating that innovation, the use of modern technology to support solutions. AI is in everyone's world now, and how do we utilise those those solutions going forward to make those efficiency savings and help us in our decision making, utilising that to understand our data and our performance and getting the best use out of that information, ensuring that information is really accurate data based on accurate data and financial figures. Really important. Next slide. So also really important is being transparent and open around demonstrating value for money. It's really key. Feeding that back to all stakeholders, so they've got a clear understanding, and that can be through your annual value for money statements. Landlords publish this on an annual basis, ensuring meeting the value for money standard requirements as well. And that, provides, clarity and openness to all stakeholders. Really important to get tenants involved as part of that decision making. That demonstrates good value for money of delivering services based on their needs. Comprehensive reporting as well. Reports should highlight the achievements, but also the challenges as well. Current challenges and future challenges and how we're going to address them. So looking at it from a point of view of strategic plan, financial plans going forward, and looking at it from a complete organisational review as well. I think sometimes we get bogged down in the individual elements and where can we make savings. It's got to be that holistic view across all services delivered and tie back again to that core purpose. Really important. And also as well, just to take into account, so just before we move on, from a group structure, I think it's really important for those organisations in the group, it needs to ensure that you can demonstrate the purpose and positive outcomes from each of those entities. How does that feed in? and demonstrate that all roads lead back to contributing those positive outcomes for the landlord and its customers and stakeholders. So, even the commercial element of it, that's how it will be viewed from a group structure perspective, not just from the social housing side of things. How do all things feed back and lead back to delivering value for money for social housing tenants? Okay, so just touching on the integrating tenant views, really, really important. It goes throughout the cross-cutting themes of within the case review work that the regulators undertaking. And if you look at some of the examples where they've picked out best practice, but areas as well that need to improve. So thing about it from a point of view, one of the key things is certainly having a real good strategic approach to the customer voice. So having a customer voice strategy and a framework that really identifies different levels of opportunities for involvement and scrutiny, just to ensure that customer voice is totally inclusive. So it's not just a handful of customers involved. It's the usual suspects from scrutiny. It's got to be right across all areas of customer scrutiny, just so it can be heard loud and clear. And think about how effective you are at facilitating those views and maximising scrutiny and influence. How you provide training, support, sharing of information, key performance indicators as well, just to make sure that involvement is in a good place and is fully informed for those who are involved. So establish that customer voice, complaints, tenant satisfaction measurements, transactional surveys, engagement vehicles, combined can make a real powerful voice. But remember to triangulate all those aspects, making sure that you hear that one voice, one consistent message. So it's really important not just to look at all of them in isolation, but to look at all elements of feedback and bringing them all together. That structured approach, whether or not it's part of the formal governance structure, i.e. customer committee, or as part of your tenant scrutiny and engagement arrangements, both of those elements do need to be formal and built into the wider tenant voice picture. It's got to be meaningful, need to demonstrate the link back to the governance structure. So think about it from a point of view of the customer committee or the formal scrutiny and reporting links into your governance arrangements. They need to be clearly documented, need to have terms of reference, in either case outline the clear remit of both those forums and the link back to boards as well. It's all about the evidence and how you can demonstrate you're listening, acting and also making a difference. So outcomes. Be transparent in how you're performing as well. So it's about closing that loop. It's really important so that you demonstrate that you are listening, that you are feeding back to tenants that are use their customer voice to influence decisions and the difference it makes as well. So demonstrate that in your performance report and link it together so you can actually see where performance has been influenced by customer voice and integrated customer feedback as well, how that's really influenced and made a difference on that performance. But also just as important as well to feedback where you haven't used the customer voice and customer feedback in certain elements. So it's really important, and customers need to know. We might have had to say, my view was this, however, it hasn't been used. Explain why it hasn't been used, the practical reasons why it couldn't be used. So explain those reasons. Be open, transparent in both sides of those matters, certainly. And that's it from point of view value for money and integrating tenant views. I'll just hand back over to Gemma now so she can run through some up and coming changes, certainly from a statutory duty point of view, but also some regulatory changes as well.
Thanks, Marcus. Some points would be really helpful to come back to in the Q&A if we have time as well. I think it's interesting, isn't it? I think the points around use of tenant data and meaningful tenant engagement can be quite difficult to work in practice. And I think it's interesting when you look at things like the rent convergence consultation, which talks about consulting with residents before implementing rent convergence. It's going to be an interesting one to deliver, and as you say, delivering some of those messages about where you may not be able to go with a wave of feedback. That's going to be quite a tough one to kind of navigate. just a quick one for me. I'm going to talk for a couple of minutes about some upcoming changes because I want to make sure we've got time for questions at the end. The point of today's session is to consolidate some of the learning from the consumer standard changes and what we've seen so far. But as you'll be aware, that picture is moving. We've got further changes expected, for example, around tenant satisfaction measures to reflect the electrical safety consultation results coming out. We've obviously got things around the rent standard changing, and as I mentioned, rent convergence with the decision on that expected in the budget towards the end of next month. We've got our law, which is 3 weeks today, which is slightly terrifying, isn't it, in relation to damp and mould hazards, and then a further extension of those requirements coming up in 2026 and 2027. And the regulator has already been hinting as well around changes to the governance and financial viability standard, which obviously came in 10 years ago now, so definitely ripe for some change. But certainly things in that are in terms of resolution and recovery planning, greater focus on asset and liability data and things like that. So one to watch this space on, although I will say on the governance and financial viability standard, that won't be a quick one. So we probably won't see anything substantive on that before kind of middle of next year, with it coming into force 2027 at the very earliest. Just a couple of things I wanted to touch on following some recent announcements we've had from the government. So we've obviously had the competence and conduct standard, and I say that in speech marks because it doesn't look like we're going to have a standalone standard on it. It's going to be interwoven with the existing standards. That's going to come into force initially in October 2026, with a transitional period coming in around the qualification requirements. Clearly you'll be familiar with this, so it came from the Grenfell tragedy and then also the social housing green paper consultation, the tenant roadshow up and down the country. And the idea is around, how do we professionalise the sector? Could we introduce qualifications and greater competency requirements to try and remove some of that stigma? Now, I think a lot of the language around this has been very, very unhelpful. Certainly the press announcements that came out on the back of the government response, I didn't think were particularly useful in terms of galvanising our workforces. But what it will mean is that we will have new requirements coming in around conduct and competence of staff who are involved in providing housing management services. It will apply both to your staff but also to third parties acting on your behalf, so things like managing agents. I'm not going to go through all the requirements now. Key things to note, as well as the qualification requirements, which have been quite heavily trailed in terms of the press, you will have to have a policy which sets out your approach to managing and developing your staff who fall within the remit, and also the steps that you're going to take to ensure that any relevant staff are competent and behave in a manner which is necessary to ensure that good quality services are being provided to your residents. And you are expected to be engaging with your tenants around that in terms of influencing and scrutinising the development of the policy and then ongoing monitoring of it. Secondly, you will have to bring in a code of conduct for your staff as well, which has to be embedded within your organisation, and that again is linked to competence and conduct requirements. Watch this space. We will get further publications from the regulator on it. You may be aware as well that there have been some releases from CIH, and there's further to come on that. They are looking at, for example, on the level 4 qualifications, the ability to use assessment only qualifications, so that would allow experience to date and things to be counted rather than necessarily having a brand new qualification from scratch. So watch this space on that one. Second one is STAIRS, so the social tenant access to information requirements. The ICO did not get what it wanted in terms of housing associations in England being fully subject to Freedom of Information Act, and we are going to have this instead. Coming into effect partly from next October, but you should be preparing now, and that's something that was quite clear in the government response to the consultation. From October 2026, the requirements around proactive publishment of information is going to come into force, and that includes things like information about your senior staff, your governance arrangements, spending, use of service charge revenue and things like that. I will say quite a lot of that is covered already under things like the NHF Code of Governance. There will be some additional things that need to be published, but it's not quite as bad as I think as it's been kind of publicised. And then from the 1st of April 2027, there'll be a requirement for you to provide information on request from social housing tenants or their representatives, and that will be a 30 calendar day response time from receipt of the request. STAIRS will be administered by the Housing Ombudsman, so they're looking at their scheme at the moment, and also the MOU with the Regulator of Social Housing in terms of how they're going to be working together. Again, various things to get your head around in terms of what you're going to need to do to comply. I think what's helpful is the response says they're not expecting you to create a brand new set of records for this, so it's using existing data. The response has said that you will be able to make reasonable redactions, so linked to data protection, commercial sensitivity and things like that. But you will be expected to have a policy that sets out when you wouldn't be publishing information. So again, further policy requirements needed there, and clearly that's something the Ombudsman will take into account when they're looking at administering this scheme going forward. No expectation that you'll be looking to renegotiate your existing contracts, but clearly you are going to have to think about your working arrangements with third parties where you do need to get data from them in able to respond to particularly tenant requests for information, so things like contractors, managing agents. There is a limit imposed within the suggested standard in terms of an 18-hour staff time limit for dealing with responses. Now, clearly, that can feel slightly terrifying in terms of 18 hours times however many tenants you have. But DLUC does say that they anticipate most requests would take significantly less time to deal with than that. Though that isn't an excuse. So if you can't say overall we're bombarded with requests so we can't respond to them within the 30-day working time, you are going to have to be getting geared up for how you're going to be able to respond to these as and when from April 2027. And I'm going to stop there for some questions. Like I said, we're going to circulate the slides with some contact details. Let me stop the share so we can see one another. There we go. Okay, so questions. Shall I kick off?
I was going to say we've had quite a few in the chat, Gemma. Do you want me to maybe pick the first one that's been in there? I think it's a tasty one, this one, so I think I'm sure we'll all have a chip into this answer. Yes. So thank you, Lizzie, for putting the question in. Just to recap it, so Lizzie's saying that sometimes it feels as if there's going to be endless reports and recommendations about things that's quite self-evident. So where, when and how, as landlords, can you gain the skills to work across silos, collate and effectively use data, bring tenants' experience into the mix and learn from neighbourhoods and become accountable? Lizzie's saying it just seems circular, even after a year of telling organisations all of this. And there's an interesting end to Lizzie's question in terms of how can the self-protective toxic cultures be changed by the people who create them? So does anyone want to, I've got a view on it, but does anyone want to come in first? Thank you, Lizzie, for that question.
I was thinking it would be good, Dan, just to pick up sort of tenants' expertise, because I know that's something that you've seen in some good examples on. I think one thing as well is it's around self-challenge, isn't it? It's around boards being very prepared to challenge themselves, to get external support in for that if needed. I think there's something around lived experience and diversity around the board table that will help with this. But yeah, definitely, it's as Marcus said, and I know Diane, you've seen, getting that meaningful input from residents is really, really important. So I don't know if one of you wants to pick up on that.
Yeah. I thought as well when I read that question that the silo working is 99% of the time indicative of the culture of an organisation, and obviously that culture piece starts at the top, for want of a better word, and in terms of the data use, it is about, from a strategic leadership direction, joining those teams together, joining those data sets together, and as you say, Mag, having that discussion at either a senior level or a board level in terms of what is the data telling you. And what I'd also advocate is that in terms of a toxic culture, it's about being brave and flagging any concerns, to your line manager. Do you have any whistleblowing policies, for example, as well? And making sure that you're flagging and highlighting where there are potential barriers to delivering great services, holistic services, and joined up to tenants.
Yeah. I think it's just key as well about integrating customers in every part. It's not just, it's really important, isn't it, to get their views on strategic decisions, but also as well, you can add just as much value looking at just individual services as well. So it's using all those different measures and it just needs to form then part of future service delivery, in the sense of it just becomes natural that, we're consulting with our customers, those who are receiving those services, and in how those services delivered, and not look at it as a task. Just look at it as part of, you know, the continuous improvement in services. But you just got to have it documented. You've got to have that approach down. People need to know this is how we do it and stick with it. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I think two things for me. One is being outcome focused. So I think that goes back to what Marcus was saying, but you know, we do see, I think particularly things like TSMs, you know, the more we put numbers into the mix, the more people focus on, you know, the movement of the number and stuff. And actually we have to think about what does it tell us about the outcome that we're achieving. I think same on competence and conduct. Really, it's not about who's got a qualification. It's about, are we delivering a respectful, good service for our residents? That's the outcome we're trying to achieve there. So trying to pull that together in terms of where does this get us on the outcome that we're trying to achieve. I think the other thing is, and you know, silo working is so common, isn't it? Particularly when you're busy and people are so task focused. I think making time and space, you know, board level, crucial to have that time and space outside of the board agenda. Easier said than done, I know, when people are busy, but you know, having that time and space to look at stuff, particularly, you know, Mags was saying about risk appetite, when you are looking at changing business plan, when you are looking at changing, you've got changing issues around financial performance, which means you need to look at your risk appetite. Having that time and space to discuss it is so crucial. Similarly for teams, you know, making the time and space for them to talk to each other about what are the barriers that are impacting you? Do you know enough about what that other team is doing and how that's impacting on yours? Because it's so easy, isn't it, for culture to crop up of, oh, it's their fault or they're causing my issues or whatever. And actually having that time and space to discuss it is really important. And I will say the organisation where I'm a board member of, it's been a common theme, thankfully not this year, but for the 3 years before that, of feeling like I don't know what the teams are doing in the business, you know, and making time and space for people to have those conversations is the only way you're going to get around that, really.
Brilliant. Another great question here from John. In an ideal world, there'd be one single data system that would do everything, but very often there's bespoke systems for each area of data. And I think John's just wondering in terms of any examples of good practice that's coming out of the casework review, or really what we've seen day to day that could address this.
Yeah, I'm thinking about it. There'll always be different systems that we use. You know, I'll be amazed if we crack that nut where we have a one system of holding all information and we're able to utilize that. It's more around the reporting that sits on top of that, really, and making sure that that reporting is consistent. You always say like one version of truth is really important, so not using different sources of information and with regards to, you know, getting that picture. It's really important to bring all elements together, but it's got to be reliable, and you know, it's got to, and that's the reason why those reporting systems are really important, to get that information out in clear, you know, definitions, clear understanding of exactly what that data is telling us. So I think that the key one, there's so many systems out there, like from, you know, Power BI to, you know, other reporting systems that you can use that will overlay over your systems and bring it all together. I think that's really important.
We're definitely seeing more use of things such as Power BI, absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, other systems are available as well, to sort of tap into those different data sources. Good one for Matt around C gradings in terms of can they be upgraded without an inspection? And I know that somebody else on the call has shared their experience in terms of their recent judgment. I think on this one, it's obviously there'll always be an improvement plan if you don't get a C1, and it is about, you know, demonstrating to the regulator that you've done what you agree to do on that improvement plan. Does anyone else want to come in on that?
I was just going to say, I mean, we know at least there's been at least one example so far where there's been a C2 and the organisation has then been regraded to C1 already within a matter of months. And I think we're aware of a couple of others that are C2 that have been advised, we'll come back and have a look at you again in a relatively short time frame. So certainly not waiting for the next 4-year cycle. Yeah. There's a couple of questions here about risk that I just wanted to pick on. Somebody said people moan when you talk about risk. I don't know why. I think for me, it's about changing the language. So instead of talking about risks and registers and controls, it's saying, what's your job? What could go wrong? What are you doing about it? And talking to people in that language. So it kind of brings it alive. And to answer Zoe's question about reviews, yes, we do absolutely see people doing reviews of their risk frameworks, maybe through their internal audit, maybe through someone like us. You know, other consultants are available, but yeah, I'm not saying that everybody is out there reviewing their risk framework every year. They're not, but certainly organisations are having periodic checks of that framework and finding it useful, hopefully.
Yeah, I would say on the risk side as well, I think it's the interplay of risks, which is really important. And what we have seen sometimes is there can be an over focus on certain things, particularly understandably, you know, in reaction to kind of high profile issues in the sector, whether that's damp and mold and things. But you've got to then think about what's the impact of the decision that we're making in the whole on our risk management framework and our risk appetite. And actually, do we need to readjust that, as Mag said, you know, or does it mean that we're going to have some kind of failure as a result of the decision we're making? And we've seen it with a couple of well-intentioned ones around things like, you know, fire safety repairs that have ultimately led to a breach of lender covenants because of the financial investment required. There has to be that understanding of the knock-on effect of the decisions that you're making and what that means in terms of risk. Definitely.
And as somebody else has said in the chat, there is always risk in housing. There absolutely is. And it's about normalizing it into the conversation. It's saying, you know, thinking about the risk register is not an add-on. It's not something somebody else does over there. It's part and parcel of running a business, running a housing organisation, delivering for customers. All of that's got to be thought about as just normal. It's part of an everyday conversation.
I do like that brakes on a car analogy, because it's that thing, isn't it? You can't drive without brakes on a car. It just helps you slow down if you need to. Do you know what I mean? It's that thing of that's what your risk management framework's there for. Yeah,
absolutely. Let's have a quick look. Have we missed anything? We're just about at time anyway.
Got, yeah, what 1 minute there. Interesting one in terms of being mid progress for plans and changes, etc. And I think the thing with this one is so, in terms of the core regulatory, it's up to you what you do and how you deliver it. And the regulator will be absolutely fine so long as it's robust, it's well worked out, it's visible, etc., etc. Introducing something like a Power BI is clearly going to improve and strengthen your position. But I think the regulator takes a very pragmatic view in terms of where improvements are being made. I think every inspection they will find different plans at different stages, and it's just being able to prove that pre this change, you know, things were robust and well, and it's going to be strengthened with your change.
They take everything into account, don't they? They never look at one aspect in isolation. It's you know, detailed review, and it's what's the whole picture telling us.
Yeah. I think what's key as well, though, is being able to demonstrate you're self-aware of areas that you need to make improvements on. It's so important. You know, I've been working with a number of organisations that mightn't necessarily have the outcomes or the evidence of the outcomes that they need to demonstrate like things like integrated, you know, customer involvement, but in their decision making, but having those clear plans in place and clear milestones as well about what they want to achieve. I think that, you know, that's a minimum. That's what needs to be, you know, required by the regulator, certainly.
Yeah. Well, we are at time. Thank you everyone for joining us, and thanks for sharing your questions and also your feedback on what's worked well in your organisation in the chat as well. I think as we've responded earlier on, we will be sharing the slides, and there'll also be a recording on YouTube, which I'm sure my teenage daughters will love. That'll be available tomorrow.
If you do have
any, mine always find it on the internet. I don't know how. If you do have any other questions, do get in touch. Our contact details will be on the slides that are circulated. And similarly, if you've got any ideas for future webinars you think would be helpful, please do let us know, because we're always keen to give stuff that's useful to you. And we hopefully see you soon. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.